Capcom is adding a lot of changes to all 14 weapons in Monster Hunter Wilds, and after testing every single one of them and having spent well over 50 hours on this less than a week demo alone, yeah, I know I might have problems. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking every single one of them in a tier list. And the way in which I'm going to be ranking them is going to go from S being the best all the way down to D, with the D ranking basically meaning that the weapon felt worse than it was in previous Monster Hunter games. The C ranking means that they're basically at the same level as they are in other games. The B ranking is generally for the weapons that, while they might be good and fun, are lacking a little bit extra. Then the A rank is for the fantastic weapons, and then the S tier is reserved for all of the phenomenal weapons. And I already know that some people are going to have issue with a couple of weapons that I'm going to place in S tier, so please keep in mind that this is all personal preference, and of course it's all based on the open beta test, meaning that Capcom can actually change the way that some of these weapons work, so these rankings are subject to change. And keep in mind that I'm going to be ranking each weapon not only in how they perform, but also how much fun they are, if they are intuitive to pick up, and if the changes the weapon received were beneficial to the weapon. With that being said, hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well, and let's get started. And the first weapon that we're going to be talking about is going to be the Sword and Shield. And the Sword and Shield has actually received quite a few significant buffs, although there is a little bit of a downside to the weapon, which I'll talk about in a moment. The Sword and Shield remains one of the most versatile weapons in the entire game, allowing you to dish out a lot of elemental damage or apply status effects with the sword attacks, and with the shield you have the ability to easily stun and KO the monster, all of that while you also have one of the easiest mounts in the entire game, as all of your attacks can be followed up by the backstep, which on top of having iframes has a lot of very powerful follow-up attacks. And since you're able to go into the air with the Sword and Shield very easily, it's one out of the 3 only weapons in the game that can use the focus strike while they are in the air, with the insect glaive and the greatsword being the other 2. And with wounding monsters and also using those wounds to use focus strike being such an important system of Monster Hunter Wilds, having a weapon that can apply them very easily, while also having access to pretty much any part of the monster very easily, is going to be a great benefit to any hunter that decides to pick up this weapon. Additionally, you now have a lot more mobility with the Sword and Shield, as not only do you have a brand new attack called the Sliding Swipe, which covers about double the distance of the advancing slash, but you also can follow up upon that sliding swipe, or pretty much any attack you do with the Sword and Shield, with some basic slash or chop attacks that allow you to move as you do them, allowing you to constantly move from weak point to weak point on the monster, while also being able to dodge incoming attacks. And naturally you also have a shield that allows you to block attacks, and a new addition in Wilds you also have the ability to perfect block an attack, which can then lead into some more powerful follow-ups. Now one of these more powerful follow-ups is the Perfect Rush, which unfortunately has been nerfed in Monster Hunter Wilds. Perfect Rush has always been one of my favorite tools from the Sword and Shield ever since it was introduced in Iceborne, and seeing it being nerfed here is a bit disappointing, but on the other hand, using the Shield Bash combo is a lot more reliable, and you have a lot more mobility with the weapon. And among the new moves that you can perform with the Sword and Shield, you have a brand new attack that is the Charge Chop, which is this downward plunge that deals a lot of damage, especially if the move is empowered, and so you can effectively replace the final hit of the Perfect Rush with the Charge Chop, something that I didn't know actually, or you can use this new move after you finish a Shield Bash combo or a regular slash combo, and this attack is particularly good at applying wounds while also dealing a lot of damage to wounded parts. But having said all of this, I feel like the Sword and Shield is missing a special sauce. I would love to see this weapon getting a flashy attack, or maybe some even crazier mobility options, kind of like you have with the Valor Sword and Shield in Generations Ultimate. And to be honest, I would also like the follow-ups for a perfect block to be a little bit better. You don't really get anything too special out of them, so more likely than not, you're never really going to play for a perfect block. You're going to try to dodge out of the way of most attacks, and if there really is no way for you to dodge out of a way of an attack, then you are going to ultimately use the block as your last resort, and maybe you get lucky and get a perfect block off, so you're not really incentivized to go after that. So currently, in my opinion, while the Sword and Shield has received significant buffs, I feel like it is lacking a special something, which is why I'm going to put it at the bottom of the A rank. Now the next weapon on the list is going to be the dual blades. Now the dual blades haven't really received any huge makeover, but they did get a few very powerful, albeit subtle additions that I think make the weapon much more fun and also more powerful to use. The dual blades are all about going into the demon mode and building up the demon gauge that allows you to use more powerful moves such as the blade dance for example, and also improves your dodge all the while your stamina is constantly being depleted. And once you fill up the demon gauge to full, you now enter the archdemon mode, where you can exit out of the demon mode and your stamina is no longer going to be depleted, but now you retain a lot of the buffs that you would get from being in demon mode, but as you perform different attacks you're going to be losing out on your archdemon mode. So with this weapon, not only is there stamina management, but you also need to manage your demon gauge to make sure that you can maintain the archdemon mode, because that allows you to do a lot more moves. But there's actually quite a few powerful additions here, because for example, if you time your dodge well while in demon mode or even archdemon mode, you can perform what is called the demon dodge. It's a very special dodge that, after you perform it, all of your dodges for a short period of time are going to deal damage to the monster, and you even have a special follow-up after that dodge. Additionally, while you retain this buff from the demon dodge, which is what makes your dual blades have this bluish glow to them, you're actually going to be dealing more damage while this is active. So perfectly dodging attacks becomes a lot more incorporated into the dual blades kit. Additionally, the blade dance that you can perform in demon mode is now split into 3 different actions, and at any point of your blade dance combo you can actually cancel out of it and return to your archdemon mode, and from there you can perform your flurry combo, which in archdemon mode has a ton of mobility, but you can also return to the blade dance combo at any point. And in fact, you can actually integrate the blade dance combo and the demon flurry combo all together at the same time. So basically you do the first part of the blade dance, you swap to the first part of the demon flurry, return to archdemon mode to do the second part of the demon flurry combo, and likewise you get the final hit of both combos. So that by itself is already pretty huge, because while this was the biggest DPS move that the dual blades had, it was the only move that left you vulnerable while you perform it. However, now because you're able to cancel out of it at any point, you are a lot safer while performing this. But on top of all of that, the dual blades have become an even safer option in Monster Hunter Wilds, as whenever you are knocked down while in demon mode, you actually also get knocked out of demon mode. So whereas in the previous games, if you were to get hit while in demon mode and you were to go down on the floor, and you have this whole 3 to 5 second animation of you getting back up, your stamina would constantly be depleted throughout the entire duration. However, in Wilds, that is no longer a concern, so that by the time that you get up, you still have remaining stamina to be able to dodge any incoming attack. And of course, one of the best tools in the dual blades arsenal is the sliding attack, which has now been integrated into the dual blades focus strike, so that whenever you perform the focus strike, you go up in the air and you perform the same Beyblade attack as you come rotating down on the monster, dealing damage along the way. And not only is it one of the most satisfying moves in the entire game, it also deals a lot of damage, and I cannot wait to see how this is going to work with some of the larger monsters once the game fully releases. So having said all of that, I'm going to put the dual blades into the S tier, and I think it's going to be the bottom of S and not any higher on this tier, simply because it didn't receive any single huge addition. And the next weapon on the list is going to be the hammer. Now the hammer, being one of the most simple weapons in the entire game, has actually received a lot of quality of life changes that I think make the weapon a lot more appealing. The hammer is all about charging up the big attacks and going up to the monster's head to dish out a lot of damage to stun them and keep them KO'd for as long as possible. And with the addition of the charged step, which is very similar to a move we had in Rise, you're now able to get mobility with the hammer while still retaining the charge level, thus making it easier for you to land those charged attacks on the monster's head. On top of that, you get a brand new very powerful move called the Mighty Charge that has the hunter spinning around the hammer in an almost comedic fashion and then unleashing this devastating blow that is going to result in a KO most of the time. And the very cool thing about this is that if you find the opening for this, you can go from the Mighty Charge into the spinning bludgeon, where you spin the hammer around as you move closer to the monster, all the while dealing damage, and from that you can go again into another Mighty Charge to deal even more damage. Not to mention that you retain the ever powerful Big Bang combo, which can also lead into the Mighty Charge. So again, the hammer still retains this very simplistic playstyle, which is still very satisfying. On top of that, it should be noted that the hammer does get an offset attack in the form of the upswing. So if you perform your basic triangle or left click combo, or you charge your hammer to level 2 and you nail that upswing on the monster as they are about to attack you, that upswing is going to act as a counter, knocking the monster down and giving you a big window of opportunity to punish it. And again, whenever you get this offset attack, you can immediately follow it up with the Mighty Charge. Now that being said, one thing that I particularly dislike about the hammer, specifically in Wild Wilds is the way in which this offset attack works, because it relies on you getting the finisher for your basic triangle combo, or for you to land your upswing while charging the hammer. It can get a little tricky to find the perfect timing to use these as the monster is about to attack you. I used the hammer a bunch in the beta, and more often than not whenever I got these counters, it was mostly a mistake, or I was very lucky at the time whenever I got those off, because I just happened to be charging the hammer at the perfect moment, so all I had to do was let go to nail the timing. That is to say that the hammer's offset attack feels like it is a bit backhanded, whereas the offset attack of the switch axe or the greatsword, for example, are a lot more front-loaded, as you can simply press triangle and circle at the same time with both weapons, and even though it does take a little bit of timing for both of them, especially the switch axe to land, you can effectively use these offset attacks as a reaction, whereas with the hammer you kind of have to predict that the monster is going to do that attack, and so you instinctively go into your overhead smash combo, or you start charging your hammer, but not too soon but also not too late, so that you make sure that you get the second level of charge to get the upswing. And I also found that the follow-up, that is to say the mighty charge, while it is a very satisfying and powerful move to use, it's sometimes a bit annoying to follow up the focus strike or these offset attacks with it, because you don't get the attack off as soon as you use the focus strike or as soon as you get the offset attack. There is this charge up period which I find to be a bit annoying, because more often than not whenever you perform a focus strike or an offset attack and you go into the mighty charge, by the time you land the mighty charge slam, the monster is already about to move, so you do need to be careful about doing any additional attacks. So that entire sequence doesn't feel as impactful, as for example you get the focus strike with the dual blades and you deal a ton of damage in a single instance, or with the charge blade or the insect glaive you get a resource back while you do it. The greatsword is maybe the closest comparison, but that one leads into the TCS, which is quicker and deals more damage and allows you to start charging your next attack, so it's just that this mechanic doesn't feel as good with the hammer in my opinion. So forgive me hammer mains, while I do enjoy the changes that they made to the hammer in Wilds, I still do believe that the Iceborne version is superior, and I am ultimately going to rank the hammer in the B tier. Now the next weapon on the list is going to be the switch axe. Now I was actually very happy with the switch axe changes in Wilds, as it looked like Capcom was putting more emphasis into buffing both the axe and the sword mode. However, as I played more with the weapon, it started to feel not as good. You're still able to build up your switch gauge very quickly in axe mode, you do 3 hits of the overhead slash combo and you pretty much get most of your energy back. And it's also quicker to build up your sword gauge in Wilds as well. The problem that I face, however, is that it feels like doing these combos or any other combos between the two different modes, including the morphing combos, they all feel like they are just there as a resource management tool and nothing else, as they deal very little to no damage, and it honestly doesn't feel great when using them. And another big problem with the switch axe that you might not even have realized is that they have massively nerfed the hit stop on a lot of the switch axe animations. Now this is not directly a nerf, as it doesn't really change how a weapon performs. It's just that the weapon feels a lot less satisfying, as a lot of your attacks are going to feel much less impactful. Now this removal of the hit stop on a lot of attack animations is actually across the board for a lot of weapons, but I felt like it was more impactful for the switch axe. Now thankfully the switch axe does get a couple of very cool additions, as not only do you get a counter while you are in axe mode, but you also get a second counter while you are in sword mode. The counter in axe mode is actually very satisfying, as it is an offset attack. It takes a little bit of practice to time it because it does have a little bit of a wind up animation, but when you nail it, it's absolutely satisfying, and it allows you to go into a couple of different follow-ups. You can either buff the axe mode or you can go into sword mode and then unleash an elemental discharge. And you can also change whatever mode you're in the middle of that follow-up animation, which is just fantastic. I like that it gives you the option to switch to a different mode if you want to. Now the sword counter on the other hand, it really doesn't feel very good to get off. It's a very weak counter, probably the weakest in the entire game, as it doesn't deal any damage, it doesn't really contribute much to the weapon's performance, and I feel like 9 times out of 10 you would rather dodge the attack and try attacking in some other way to punish the monster and maybe use this counter as a last resort. But the thing that maybe is the most disappointing about the switch axe is that it feels much more centralized as a weapon, as pretty much you always want to go into the unbridled slash and the full release slash. This big finisher that you can perform after an amped elemental discharge or even after a lot of your attacks in sword mode really is the big finisher for the switch axe in Wilds, and it does so much damage compared to everything else that it kind of feels like everything else you're doing is just to build up to this point. And in a way it kind of feels like the charge blade way of loading up the files to build up the super amped elemental discharge, but in this case it's the full release slash. Now don't get me wrong, the animation is very cool, very very powerful, very flashy, and again, it deals a ton of damage at once. But it feels like you're being discouraged from doing anything else in the game with the weapon, and I've always felt like the switch axe was this weapon that it was all about maintaining a perfect balance of axe mode and sword mode, and true mastery of this weapon was all about using the morphing combos at the right time to maintain damage on the monster and maintain all of your resources while also dodging incoming attacks at the same time. And it kind of feels like we're running away from that type of weapon, and the more I played with it, the more I felt like it wasn't as appealing as it once was, especially considering that the switch axe in Sunbreak is in my opinion the perfect iteration of the weapon, maybe a bit too powerful with the counter that it had, but the weapon really felt great as you were incentivized to swap between the two different modes to deal a ton of damage, and then you also had the counter which dealt a ton of damage and loaded your sword gauge and put you into amped state in an instant. So I still very much like the switch axe and I don't have any complaints in regards to the weapon's performance. I just would like to see it less centralized and maybe see a small buff to the sword counter. So for those reasons, I'm going to be putting the switch axe in the B tier as well. Now the next weapon on the list is going to be the hunting horn, and boy am I happy to tell you that the hunting horn in Wilds is actually a huge improvement that is the perfect evolution of what we had in both World and Rise. You still have all of your supportive abilities, being able to play melodies to buff yourself up as well as your allies, but now you have a lot more options and ways to deal damage while also playing those notes. That is to say that if you are playing the hunting horn well in Wilds, you're going to spend less time preparing your melodies and instead you'll have more uptime on dealing damage to the monster, because now you have many more ways of being able to store notes as you do different attacks, allowing you to prepare your melodies a lot quicker. Additionally, there's this new mechanic, the performance speed, which is whenever you press the R2 button to do a performance, you get a minigame kind of like Perfect Rush where you need to perfectly time your button inputs, and if you do it, you're going to be able to smack the monster for a lot of damage, and thus the weapon is a lot more engaging. Additionally, you also get the offset melody, which counts as an offset attack, so you're actually able to counter monster attacks with it. And what I like about the offset attack is that for one, it is a rather simple attack that comes off very quickly, but you can input the notes for the offset melody and the game is going to bank that offset melody and it's never going to override it unless you use it. So you don't have to worry about preparing the offset melody too early and then not being able to use it because you end up getting the button presses for a different melody that end up overriding it. And another cool thing about the offset melody is that you can actually hold down the R2 button while you're doing the attack, and the hunter will be prepared in position for when you let go of the attack to get the perfect timing for the counter. From my experience, this is the easiest offset attack to land, and so having such a consistent counter on a weapon like this is a phenomenal tool. Additionally, one more mechanic that we get in Wilds is the echo bubble. You're actually able to place down 3 of these different bubbles, and while you are doing the dance animation of setting down these bubbles, you can actually do different button presses that will count as your next melody, kind of like you can store notes with different attacks. So it all ties back to what I said earlier about you being able to prepare melodies a lot quicker while maintaining your uptime. And what this echo bubble does on top of giving you extra evasion is that whenever you play a melody on your hunting horn, regardless of whether you are inside or outside of the bubble, those bubbles are going to react and essentially refract the damage that you deal with the notes, even if you're not hitting the monster yourself. So this is the perfect setup that you can do at the start of a hunt, where you get close to the monster, you set up the bubble and you start applying all of your buffs, and while you're doing it, with each button press you're essentially just dealing more damage to the monster. And again, even if you are outside of the bubble but the monster is inside of the bubble, you're even able to hit them from a distance. And finally, the focus strike for the hunting horn is also very satisfying. That comes with a special rhythm game as well. While you are performing this focus strike, you can input different notes to be able to prepare your next melody, but if you input them at the right time, you're going to be able to dish out a lot more damage and even get a different finisher with the focus strike. And this is what I mean when I say that the hunting horn in Wilds feels like the perfect improvement over what we had in previous games. It still retains the core identity of the weapon of being able to apply buffs while still KOing monsters and being aggressive, but it's a lot more engaging now with many more things for you to be able to do, while also offering a lot of quality of life improvements. So for those reasons, I'm actually going to place the hunting horn into the S tier. Now the next weapon on the list is going to be the lance. Now the lance has actually gotten a couple of powerful moves, with a triple thrust that you can do at the end of a basic combo being very powerful, dealing a lot of damage, and now with the addition of focus mode you can be a lot more precise with the lance. You also have the counter thrust that you can do with the lance, where if you time your button press right you're able to counter the monster's attacks. Now the lance is a weapon that I felt would be one of the best weapons to benefit from focus mode, because it allows you to ensure that you're always being precise with the weapon, always hitting the weak spots, which is something that the lance always loves to do, while also ensuring that you are always facing the monster, which means that you'll be able to block any incoming attack. However, from my experience, it felt like the lance was one of the more clunky weapons in Wilds. It didn't feel as fluid to me as it did in World and Iceborne and even Rise and Sunbreak. The triple thrust is by far one of the best things that the weapon has received, but it felt like the entire kit was pretty much revolving around you being able to get it. And as a result, the lance being a weapon that is all about maintaining aggression and perfect blocking attacks to be able to counter them, that aspect of the weapon ended up feeling a little bit weaker because it felt like it was all in favor of that triple thrust. The counter thrust also felt somewhat clunky. I couldn't get it off as many times as I felt like I should have been able to, nor did it feel as satisfying as some of the counters that we had in previous games. There's also the issue that in the demo, the monsters really weren't all that threatening, and so the lance being a weapon that is all about blocking, it's kind of hard to get a proper gauge for how good the weapon is when the monsters aren't as aggressive as they are going to be in the endgame of Wilds. Another particular issue that I had with the lance was, for one, how much it burns through sharpness, but that has always been a thing. It's one of the weapons that consumes sharpness the most, so us not having access to razor sharp or any other skill like that means that the weapon is going to feel slightly less powerful. But another thing that I think is very important is the focus strike, and I really didn't like the focus strike on the lance. The first portion of the focus strike where you hit the monster with the shield is pretty cool, but I always found it that whenever I tried to land the follow-up, even while in focus mode throughout the entire duration, was pretty difficult for me to guarantee that I would land on a weak spot. And I also felt that it often would put me in places kind of like right below the monster's head or besides one of the arms, and I felt like I had to reposition right after doing the focus strike because I was now in a worse position. I don't know, it just felt a little bit clunky, not very intuitive. Maybe it's just a personal thing and I needed to spend more time with the lance, but I have to admit I didn't have a fantastic time with this weapon. And this is coming from someone that has made a few videos here and there in Sunbreak and Iceborne as well, mentioning how powerful and underrated the lance is. Ultimately, the lance just did not click with me, so I am going to put it in the B tier. Now the next weapon on the list is going to be the Gunlance, and boy oh boy what a comeback story this is. The Gunlance has now become a much more fun, engaging and overall powerful weapon in Wilds, and this is only the demo. One of the biggest changes that they have made to the Gunlance is that now shelling is going to scale with your attack. This is going to allow Gunlance to deal much more damage, especially by the time you hit the endgame where the shelling damage was previously capped in all of the other games, so this should be a lot more fun. Additionally, you now have a lot more movement options in Wilds while shelling and also while doing the wide sweeps that you're going to be doing a lot, because the wide sweeps have a lot of amazing follow-ups, such as the incredible new combo, the multi-worm stake full blast, that is essentially you combining a full blast combo with a wyvern stake combo with a worm stake combo, but doing two of them at the same time. And what's more, you can follow that up with not one but two wyverns fire, and all of that feels very intuitive. The combos are very easy to input, and with you being able to aim your attacks with focus mode and again all of the mobility you have now, you may not even need to have a Vade extender on the Gunlance anymore. And as if all of that wasn't enough, you now get even more guard points than before, so the weapon just feels a lot better now. And given that the Gunlance is a weapon with the shield, you can of course lead to power clashes with a monster that have this really cool animation where you jam the Gunlance into the monster's mouth and fire off a huge explosion, dealing a lot of damage. Now, I personally never was a huge Gunlance enjoyer. While I did play the weapon occasionally and I did use it for a couple of monsters that I had some trouble with, like Archtemper Nergigante when it first released for example, it was never a weapon that I used a lot because it felt a bit too slow and also that the payoff wasn't all that amazing. But now in Wilds the conversation is totally different. Not only are you a lot more mobile, but you also have these really cool and flashy combos that deal a lot of damage, are easy to land and are a lot of fun to play with. Now there is still a lot of commitment went with the Gunlance's attacks. Do not get that mixed. But now that you have all of this extra safety with the weapon, it doesn't feel as bad to go for some of those more high commitment attacks. Now there is one thing that I did not like about the Gunlance, and that is in particular the focus strike. The focus strike of the Gunlance was actually a little bit different when it was first showcased in the Gunlance trailer, because in that trailer we see the hunter moving along the monster as they are using the focus strike, but in the Wilds demo, whenever you try to use the Drake Auger, the focus strike, it felt as if you could barely move your hunter. You could simply just change the direction in which you were aiming your attack, and so this very long dragged out animation where you are essentially drilling into the monster felt so much worse to use, to the point where I felt like it was much more advantageous to you to simply not use the focus strike and simply deal damage to the wounded part. Now, I'm not sure if the developers are going to end up changing this, or if there is a skill in the game that you can equip to make you more mobile while you're using the focus strike, but as far as the demo is concerned, I felt like it was the weak point of the weapon. That being said, I'm still very excited for the Gunlance in Monster Hunter Wilds, as it was one of my favorite weapons in the entire demo. And for that reason, I'm going to be placing the Gunlance at the top of the S tier. What a crazy world we live in to see the Gunlance this high on the list. The next weapon on the list is going to be the Charge Blade, a transforming weapon that is all about loading up the files to charge it up and deal extra damage. The Charge Blade in Wilds received a lot of great quality of life changes, but also some mechanical and somewhat controversial additions. Now, one very cool and simple addition that it received is that the guard points are now flashing whenever they are available, so you have this indicator letting you know whenever you can trigger a guard point, so that is very helpful. Additionally, you now have the ability to overcharge your files, whereas in the previous games, if you had your files already loaded and if you were to load some additional files, it would simply waste them. In Wilds, you can actually overcharge them, which will allow you to increase the damage that you deal with those files by around 40%, and if you load those overcharged files into your shield, you can actually extend the duration of which you spend with your shield being buffed. Speaking of which, another very good quality of life addition in Wilds is the ability to very quickly boost your shield, whereas in the previous games you will need to load your files, go into a shield thrust, start the animation for an amped elemental discharge and cancel it into the shield to be able to empower it. However, now in Wilds you can simply, after loading the files, keep holding the circle button or right click and you're going to load up all of those files into the shield and boost it in an instant. And best of all, this animation where your shield is out in front actually has a guard point, so you are actually safe while doing this. Now, the Charge Blade in Wilds has much less focus on the Super Amped Elemental Discharge, the SAED, as now in order to get into a Super Amped Elemental Discharge you need to do a regular Amped Elemental Discharge beforehand, which actually does have an Elemental Discharge follow-up to deal some additional damage, and only then can you go into the Super Amped Elemental Discharge. So because you need to do this initial Amped Elemental Discharge to get into the SAD, a lot of people are saying that the SAD spam playstyle is dead. Now, you can actually still shortcut into the SAD with a guard point, so you can, for example, place down a mini barrel bomb, use it for a guard point and go straight into the SAD. It's not exactly ideal if you're someone that loves the SAD playstyle, but you still have that option. However, on the other hand, a lot more of the Charge Blade's budget has been allocated to the Savage Axe mode. And to enter the Savage Axe mode in Wilds, you need to perfect block an incoming attack, or you do it by consuming a wound with a focus strike. And when you enter Savage Axe mode, not only do you gain access to some crazy damage numbers with some very simple triangle and circle combos, but you also only consume half of your files whenever you are in Savage Axe mode, which means that you're going to be able to stay in that mode for much longer. And you also don't necessarily lose the Savage Axe mode whenever you spend all of your files. You can go back into Sword mode and charge all of them, and you can actually overcharge those files so that you can deal more damage while you are in Savage Axe mode. And from my personal experience, the Savage Axe mode in Wilds actually felt very satisfying, engaging and fun. A lot of the older Charge Blade mains, or even just enjoyers like myself, might not enjoy the fact that the true and classic SAD spam playstyle from 4U is much less viable. But I would also like to point out that in a demo we didn't have access to skills like capacity boost and artillery that would make that playstyle much more powerful, and combining that with the overcharged files could result in a lot more damage. That being said, another cool thing that the Charge Blade is getting is of course the Power Clash, since you of course have a shield. And you can actually trigger the Power Clash very easily with a Charge Blade, given that you go for guard points or whenever you do the quick load into your shield, and that can of course lead to the monster being toppled and you being able to deal a lot more damage, so that that's a fun addition. In my opinion, the biggest downside of the Charged Blade in Wilds is the over-reliance on wounds or perfect blocks to maintain the Savage Axe mode. If you are playing the weapon optimally, you're going to be able to maintain the Savage Axe mode a lot easier than someone that isn't as experienced with the weapon because they won't be able to land those perfect blocks. However, if you're playing in multiplayer, this can be a little bit tricky because you need the monster to pay attention to you in order to perfect block, and of course you also need your teammates to not consume all of the wounds before you activate the Savage Axe mode. I also felt like the Charged Blade could be just a little bit better. I wouldn't exactly say that it is amazing as some of the other weapons that we saw here in the video, so ultimately I am placing the Charged Blade in the A tier. Now the next weapon on the list is going to be the Greatsword, a simple weapon that is all about charging up your big swings to deal massive damage. Now the damage distribution for the Greatsword charge levels in Wilds is much less back-ended. That is to say that the damage of the first and second charge levels has been increased, but on the other hand, the damage of the final charge, the true charge slash or TCS, has been reduced. So that is something to take into account. That being said, the biggest deal for the Greatsword in Wilds is of course the ability to now easily aim your charged attacks with the addition of focus mode, ensuring that you can land all of your charged slashes on the monster's weak spots as you are able to spin your character almost 180 degrees on every attack. On top of that, the Greatsword also gets a counter in the form of the offset rising slash that you're able to use from neutral and can also be charged so that you can perfectly time it with the monster attack, often resulting in the monster being pushed back and you performing a follow-up that has you using the slinger as a gap closer, and you can then go into the TCS for some beefy damage. Another shortcut for the TCS is the Focus Strike, which has you slashing through the monster, dragging the Greatsword across it to destroy wounds, dealing good damage, and letting you follow up directly into the TCS. And perhaps one of the most surprising things is that blocking with the Greatsword is actually useful now. As for one, it can result in a power clash, which again allows you to topple the monster and gives you a big window to deal big damage. But on top of all of that, you can also perfect guard with the Greatsword, which allows you to nullify all damage taken, and you don't even lose any of your sharpness, and you can immediately follow it up with a charge slash to get into the TCS. Overall, I would say that the Greatsword has felt amazing in Wilds, as all of these additions really help the weapon feel much more consistent and thus much more satisfying to use. And keep in mind that we didn't even have the skill focus in the Wilds demo, so it will be even quicker for us to charge our Greatsword whenever the game releases. Though having said all of that, I'm not as excited to play Greatsword in Wilds comparing to the weapons that I have currently placed in the S tier. Don't get me wrong, it feels great to play Greatsword, but maybe it's the reduced hit stop that is making me less excited about picking up this weapon. And so for those reasons, I'm going to be ranking the Greatsword at the very top of the A tier, but just not quite enough to reach into the S in my opinion. And after that we get to the Longsword, the long-reaching weapon that allows you to keep up the aggression as you counter and dodge all incoming attacks. Now the Longsword has received a lot of additions that make the weapon not only easier to use but also more powerful by giving you tons of new options and combo routes. You still have the counter focus playstyle with you having the foresight slash and the EI counters to be able to dodge incoming attacks while still dealing damage and increasing your spirit gauge. However, one new mechanic of the Longsword that allows you to very quickly charge your spirit gauge is the spirit charge, which by holding the R2 button you are able to charge up this attack. You can let go of the button at any moment, and depending on when you do so, you will go into a different hit of your spirit combo, allowing you to go straight into the spirit round slash and instantly level up your spirit gauge, effectively having a way to start combat with one spirit level right at the start. Additionally, Spirit Helmbreaker, which is the biggest damage dealer of the Longsword, is now better than ever, as it can now be cancelled while you are in the air by simply sheathing the Longsword, so if the monster is about to move or roar and you know that you're not going to be able to land it, you're not going to waste that spirit level. Additionally, there is now a follow-up to the Spirit Helmbreaker in the form of the Spirit Release Slash. To perform this attack, you'll need to consume an extra spirit level, with the reward being a lot more damage. And this Spirit Release Slash is actually a ranged projectile, meaning that even if the monster begins to move away after you use it, you will actually still be able to land it. What's more, both the initial thrust animation of the Spirit Helmbreaker as well as the animation for the Spirit Release Slash, both of these have hyper armor, meaning that you can use them to avoid roars or power through attacks while dealing high amounts of damage. But we're not done with the longsword, as on top of all of that you also get some brand new combos. For starters, your Spirit Slash combo, which is your R2 combo, can now be interrupted by different attacks, and you can resume the combo from the point where you left it off, allowing you to extend those combos and also have an easier time leveling up your Spirit Gauge. Which, by the way, all it takes to level up the Spirit Gauge one level now is to do one single Fate Slash into the Spirit combo. Additionally, once you get to the red Spirit Gauge level, you get a ton of brand new moves, granting you much more mobility while also increasing your damage. You can follow up the Spirit Round Slash with the Spitting Crimson Slash that allows you to reposition, deal good damage, and maintain the red gauge for longer, as while you are in the red Spirit Gauge level, it actually depletes over time. Your basic triangle or left click attacks are replaced with the Crimson Slash combos, which deal a lot more damage. And lastly, your Foresight Slash also changes, now becoming the Foresight Whirl Slash, turning into a leaping dodge of sorts that deals damage to the monster as you evade the attack into any direction you want while also increasing the red gauge duration. All of these new combos make the idea of staying in the red Spirit Gauge level to deal damage a lot more appealing, rather than simply leveling up your Spirit Gauge to the maximum to unleash the Spirit Helmbreaker, and in the case of wilds using the follow-up, and keep following this loop. There's actually a reason to use these combos, which I think makes the weapon much more satisfying. Although more likely than not, whenever the game releases, we are eventually going to end up at the point where using the Spirit Helmbreaker and the follow-up is going to be the optimal way to use the weapon. The focus track of the longsword is also very powerful, allowing you to target a monster part, and depending on how many wounds you hit, that is how many Spirit Gauge levels you will gain. So the monster's wounds can be used as another shortcut to level up your Spirit Gauge, so it won't become a massive issue if you are playing in multiplayer, because you are not dependent on those wounds to level up your Spirit Gauge. It simply is another way for you to level up your Spirit Gauge, of which you already have plenty. And having said all of that, I could honestly not go on with the video without putting the longsword in the S tier, simply because of the amount of amazing things that it has received in wilds. The weapon already felt pretty complete in base world, and frankly all of these additions are pretty crazy, although I would argue that it's not as egregious as it was in Rise. Though maybe once we add the skill quick sheath into the mix, the longsword might just become incredibly overpowered. For me personally, it's just a very fun and powerful weapon that I love to use, and if I ever have trouble with a monster, it's always going to be a reliable option. The next weapon on the list is going to be the bow, the first of the ranged weapons that is incredibly mobile and excels at medium to close range. One key feature of the bow is that now the coatings are no longer consumable items that you need to apply on the bow in order to use more powerful shots, as they are now tied to the trick arrow gauge. The trick gauge allows you to apply different coatings or even fire tracer arrows, which I'll explain in a moment, though these coatings will only apply to 8 shots now, but the trade-off is that they are no longer consumable, so you don't need to bring a bunch of different mushrooms and combine all of them to craft the arrows in the middle of the hunt. This also makes using the bow in the early game while you are still without a huge supply of consumable items a much more appealing thing. Anyways, back to the trick gauge. Landing attacks or successfully performing the discerning dodge, which is a new perfect dodge mechanic, kind of like the adapt dodge from GU, will allow you to replenish the trick gauge by a little bit, and whenever you load a tracer or apply a coating, you will consume that gauge. As for the tracer, you load them into your arrows, and when fired, it will attach to the monster you're hunting and stay there for a moment. From then on until your tracer is detonated, all of your shots will automatically home in on that tracer. So essentially the bow now has auto aim whenever you apply a tracer to the monster, making it very easy for you to always land attacks on the weak spot. And because when using the bow you are essentially always holding down the L2 button to aim your attacks, it means that you are always in focus mode, so it is very easy for you to use the focus fire, which is called the Hailstorm. It acts as a shot lock from Kingdom Hearts, basically loading up the different wounds or tracers that you have applied to a monster, and when you let go of the right bumper you'll fire a barrage of arrows that will home in on the wounds or the tracers, and doing this will deal increased damage to the monster, so it is very much something you should always try to do. You can then follow up this Hailstorm with a Dragon Piercer for some extra firing power, dealing a lot more damage. Additionally, there is now an alternative to the Dragon Piercer in Wilds, the 1000 Dragons, and instead of the usual pierce attack that goes through the entire body of a monster, this is a powerful spread shot that shoots more arrows than normal, dealing a lot of damage at close range. And if you were an arc shot lover, do not worry, worry, they are still in the game, as arc shot will now apply tracers onto a target, and you don't consume any of your trick gauge whenever you apply these tracers with the arc shot, meaning that you can then apply additional tracers and blow them all up with a hailstorm, dealing a massive amount of damage. So having said that, the bow remains a very powerful and mobile weapon that is now even more reliable as well as beginner friendly with the auto aim thanks to the tracers, as well as the coatings no longer being consumable items. It's not quite enough for me to place the bow in the S tier, but I'm going to place it at the very top of the A tier. Next up, we have the insect glaive, perhaps the most controversial weapon in Monster Hunter Wilds because of the major changes and overhauls it has received, along with a lesser focus on aerial combat. Now, the insect glaive, as most of you probably know, is all about collecting the triple extract from the monster by sending out the Kinsect, allowing you to unlock an expanded moveset and deal more damage. Now, for the most part, all of the buffs behave pretty much the same way as they did before, with the notable difference that the orange buff this time around no longer grants earplug small, though it does still give you flinch free, so it is a bit of a nerf. Now, the way in which you collect these extracts is the same as before. You send out your Kinsect to collect them. However, now you're able to charge up your Kinsect before you send it out by simply holding down the right trigger, which will allow the Kinsect to pierce through the monster and collect up to 3 extracts as it passes through. So this makes the job of the insect glaive of collecting all 3 extracts a little bit quicker, though it should be noted that sending out the Kinsect was bugged in the demo, as it would occasionally fly up into the sky whenever you were aiming at the monster. Now, one mechanic that is incredibly important for the insect glaive, much more than many other weapons, is focus mode, as all of your attacks with the insect glaive are followed up by the Kinsect while you are in focus mode, allowing you to deal much more damage over the course of the entire hunt. So it is greatly encouraged that you use toggle mode to always have it active. Now, one thing that people don't like about the insect glaive is that you no longer vault back into the air after doing an aerial attack, whereas back in Monster Hunter World you could do this up to 5 times, and in Rise it was up to 3 times, and now in Wilds you bounce back into the air not even once. A lot more focus of the insect glaive this time around has been put into the new move, the Rising Spiral Slash. You perform it by using an initial charged attack by holding down circle or right click while having the red buff or the triple extract, then follow up by pressing circle again while in focus mode. This will propel you into the air and deal massive amounts of damage with the cost of losing all of your extract buffs, though the Kinsect will collect 3 extracts while performing the animation, so you can get lucky and get back all 3 of them in an instant. The same charged attack can also be used in the air following a vaulting attack, allowing you to perform 2 attacks in midair provided you let go of the button before you hit the ground. But then there's the Focus Strike, one of the most powerful tools for the insect glaive in Wilds, as while the monster is wounded you can jump back while sending out your Kinsect, dealing a big burst of damage and collecting all 3 extracts in an instant. This makes it the perfect tool to use after the Rising Spiral Slash, making for a gameplay loop consisting of collecting all 3 extracts, expanding them to use the Rising Spiral Slash, and getting them back with the Focus Strike, rinse and repeat. This makes for a simple and closed loop that, along with the lesser focus on aerial combat, many people seem to not find fun or satisfying. It's true that the insect glaive has a glaring problem when it comes to controls, as it may feel somewhat clunky to pull these combos off on a controller without rebinding some of the buttons, so it may detract from your enjoyment of the weapon. Ultimately, I find the insect glaive to be an incredibly fun and powerful weapon. It's the one I used the most in the demo after all, and is likely the weapon I will main once Monster Hunter Wilds releases. I admit that there's some problems with the weapons, but as someone that used to main insect glaive when World first released, I always personally preferred the grounded playstyle as it dealt a lot more damage and felt a lot more interactive, so it's not a big issue for me personally that you don't get as much focus on aerial combat this time around, though I do understand where a lot of people are coming from. So with all of that said, I'm going to be ranking the insect glaive in the S tier. Now all that we have left are the 2 bowguns, so let's start with the slower of the 2, the heavy bowgun. Of course the heavy bowgun comes with all types of different ammunitions, with the more standard being the normal, pierce and spread, but then you also have the cluster bombs and some others for example. And you'll find that this bowgun is much more focused on simply dealing damage rather than utility, but it does have some cool and unique things that make the weapon a little bit more fun. You get a gauge with the heavy bowgun like in the previous games, though this time around round it's called the ignition mode, which is used for both Wyvern Heart, the big Gatling gun that fires the barrage of bullets that ramps up in damage the more you hit the enemy, and Wyvern Snipe, where your hunter goes into a prone position to fire a big powerful singular shot. But on top of that, there's also the new Wyvern counter that you perform by holding down triangle or left click that creates this big explosion, and if you time it right, just as a monster is about to hit you, it'll count as an offset attack, giving you a big opening for huge damage, so that is very fun and quite strong and definitely very satisfying whenever you pull it off. Now, much like with the bow, as long as you're aiming the bowguns, you are already in focus mode. For the heavy bowgun, you get these 3 special bullets that are indicated above the ignition gauge that you consume to perform the focus strike, which is called Wyvern Howl, that deal increased damage to the monster's wound and will replenish exclusively over time. And naturally, given that it's a ranged weapon, it'll be fairly easy to hit those wounds for some big damage. You've also got a shield with the heavy bowgun always, whereas before that was a modifier that you would have to customize and slot into your heavy bowgun. And naturally, you can use it to block incoming attacks, therefore you can trigger a power clash which allows you to topple the monster and can give you a big window of opportunity to deal some big damage. But another really cool thing tied to the shield of the heavy bowgun is that this time around you also get auto guard. Now, the way that it works is a little bit clunky, but you can essentially adopt a guard position, and while holding it, all the attacks that come from the front will automatically be blocked, provided that they aren't attacks that you need to have a skill like guard up to block them. So that is going to make the heavy bowgun easier to use, provided that it is a fairly slow weapon with a very long dodge animation and a very long sheath animation as well, so the auto guard is going to come in handy. Having said that, I don't find heavy bowgun to be very satisfying, as I don't particularly get a kick out of using it. Honestly, the bowguns just don't do it for me. The enjoyment comes mostly from later on in the game, beating up another dragon with an overpowered endgame build so that I can cut down some time on my farming. But on that note, I like every addition that the heavy bowgun has received in Wilds, and it certainly feels more engaging for me than it did in previous iterations of the weapon, so for that reason I'm going to place it at the bottom of the B tier. And finally, we have the light bowgun, the faster, more nimble and utility-focused version of the two bowguns. With it, on top of having much faster animations and just being overall more mobile, light bowgun gets a wider spread of ammo types than a heavy bowgun, including buffs that you can apply to yourself and your allies, status ailments to inflict on the monster, and even various elemental ammo so that you can exploit the monster's weaknesses. And as for the changes and the new additions, you now have a special gauge that allows you to go into rapid fire mode, letting you fire more shots in quick succession, with the gauge replenishing over time. It's pretty cool that the rapid fire mode works with all ammo types, so you'll be able to make some pretty cool stuff like rapid fire spread light bowgun, though unlike the Wyvern Heart from the heavy bowgun, you do still need to pay attention to your ammo and reload the gun while in rapid fire mode. I personally like rapid fire mode a lot. Seeing the animation of the hunter popping in the extra magazine on the gun is pretty satisfying, and the light bowgun feels a lot more fun and powerful to use with rapid fire mode on. Then there's the chaser shot. These are essentially empowered shots that you can fire by pressing circle or right click after firing a shot. You can think of them as a more powerful follow-up. It can feel a bit clunky on controller, but the chaser shot will also increase the recovery rate of rapid fire mode, so making sure that you use chaser shot as much as possible is going to be important to the performance of the weapon. Additionally, there's a similar thing you can do with the light bowgun, where if immediately after you fire a shot you try to go for a dodge, you will go into this sliding dodge animation where the hunter will be firing the bowgun at the same time. I didn't find it to be quite as enjoyable or intuitive as the quick sliding reload from Iceborne, for example, but it's cool that they give you a way to keep dealing damage with the light bowgun while also dodging, and works well with the weapon being much more agile. As for the focus strike of the light bowgun, this one is called the Eagle Strike shot, where you fire a powerful shot at the monster's wound to deal some serious damage. And you can even hold down the R1 button to charge up the shot to deal increased damage and also increase the range of the explosion. And much like with the heavy bowgun, you've got 3 bullets to perform the focus strike that are indicated above the gauge and replenish over time. As for the 4th bullet, bullet on the left with a different icon, that one is reserved for the Wyvern Blast, which now only has one single charge. It's that thing where you place down an explosive charge on the floor, and firing shots while on top of it or at a monster that is standing on top of it will create these explosions that deal extra damage, and I believe that they can also be triggered by teammates. Going from having 3 charges back in World to now only having one single charge of Wyvern Blast in Wilds is indeed quite a bit of a nerf, though I did notice it charging pretty fast, and there may be some ways to increase the count, much like how capacity boost works with the charge blade files and the Gunlance shells. All in all, the light bowgun is a very honest and straightforward weapon with not a whole lot of flair or spectacle. It's in my opinion a very mundane one-note playstyle and a weapon that I would only really take out for a specific purpose, like applying different status ailments or using different elements, though it should be stated that given the fact you'll be able to bring 2 weapons with you on a hunt in Wilds, the light bowgun is always going to be a great all-around choice for a secondary weapon at the very least, if not for anything else than to paralyze and put to sleep a monster at the very beginning of the hunt for some cheesy extra damage. But I would be lying to myself if I said that I enjoyed using it in Wilds, and again I did have more fun with the light bowgun in previous games, so I'm going to be placing it in the C tier. I am honestly pretty amazed at how I am ranking so many of these weapons this high on the list. Now of course this is only the impression from the demo that I have played over 50 hours with all of these weapons, so my opinion may potentially change once the game fully releases. Though having said that, I am very impressed by what the developers have done for most of the weapons, and I'm very confident that with some additional skills a lot of these would even be ranking higher on the list. Of course, let me know if you disagree with any of my placements. I didn't want to make a ranking like this just 1 or 2 days into the demo without having actually properly experienced all of the weapons, because I felt like it would be dishonest and I wanted to give every weapon a fair shot. With all of that said, if you have enjoyed this video then please subscribe to the channel. My name is Dark Hero, thank you all so much for watching, and as always, happy hunting!